Tonight, we dive into the stories of some of the most infamous women in Roman history. Women who shattered reputations, manipulated their way to power, and left behind a legacy of betrayal, murder, and scandal. These women didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote them. From poisoning emperors to seducing generals and even masterminding civil wars, they weren't just dangerous, they were unforgettable. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying the content. And we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to share and let us know what time it is on your end. Sometimes our stories are so captivating that we're still working on the more mundane ones. Now let's dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for some background noise, and settle in for tonight's tale. The mother who made a monster Agrippina the Younger was born into the very heart of Roman power. As the daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and the sister of Emperor Caligula, she was part of a family that knew the cost of power. But in ancient Rome, power wasn't inherited peacefully. It had to be seized, often with manipulation and deceit. From the very start, Agrippina understood the game. Though she was exiled in her youth, a reminder that even women in the imperial family were disposable, she bided her time. When Caligula was murdered and her uncle Claudius became emperor, Agrippina saw her opportunity. She seduced him and married him, securing her position as empress. But she wasn't content with just being a consort. She wanted to rule. Agrippina's son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, became her obsession. She arranged for his adoption by Claudius, gradually elevating him over Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. Every move was calculated, every ally carefully selected. She even had coins minted with her image beside the emperor's, a bold move for a woman in Rome. When Nero's position was secure, Claudius mysteriously died. The official story was that he died from illness, but the whispered truth was far darker. Agrippina served him a dish of his favorite poison, mushrooms. Nero was crowned emperor at just 16, and for a while, Agrippina ruled through him. She attended public events, read his correspondence, and met with senators. But as is often the case with powerful mothers, Nero began to resent her control. He stripped her of her titles, removed her guards, and moved her to a separate residence. Yet Agrippina wasn't easy to eliminate. Nero tried to kill her by sending her on a collapsing boat, but she managed to swim to safety. Finally, he ordered her assassination. She was stabbed to death in her villa. Legend has it that when the assassin raised his blade, she bared her stomach and said, "Strike here." For this bore Nero. Agrippina's life was a cautionary tale, a reminder that in Rome, even the most powerful women could be disposed of, often by the very people they helped create, Messalina. The Empress of Excess Valeria Messalina married Emperor Claudius when she was still a teenager. On the surface, she appeared to be everything an empress was expected to be, beautiful, young, and of noble blood. But behind the facade, Rome whispered about her true nature, and soon those whispers became impossible to ignore. Messalina's name became synonymous with scandal. In a society that valued modesty, at least in theory, she was a flame in a room full of oil lamps. While Claudius, an awkward and bookish man, buried himself in his administrative duties, Messalina turned the palace into her playground. She used her position to amass power and pleasure, taking lovers from all ranks, senators, nobles, even military officers. Those who pleased her were rewarded, and those who displeased her disappeared. But her dangerous ambition went beyond just affairs. Messalina was politically ambitious, eliminating rivals with false accusations and executions. She wanted not just passion but power and permanence. Then Messalina made a fateful mistake. While Claudius was away, she married her lover in a public ceremony, an act that was both treasonous and audacious. An empress could not marry another man while the emperor was still alive. When the news reached Claudius, he could hardly believe it. But the evidence was undeniable, and Messalina was executed without trial. Her beauty and tears couldn't save her, and she died at the young age of 23. To many, she became a symbol of ultimate feminine corruption, the empress who let desire drown duty. But perhaps she was simply a woman who wanted more than Rome was willing to give. Fulvia, the woman who went to war before Agrippina, before Messalina, there was Fulvia. Born into a powerful Roman family, Fulvia's life was meant to follow the traditional arc of noble women in the late Republic: marriage, children, and silence. But Fulvia was no mere ornament. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her first two husbands were populist leaders who stirred the masses: Clodius Pulcher and Gaius Scribonius Curio. Both died violently, caught up in the chaos of Roman politics. But Fulvia didn't retreat into grief. She stepped forward, claiming control of their political legacies and their mobs. Then came her third and most famous husband, Mark Antony. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Roman Republic fractured. Fulvia stood by Antony's side, not as a passive wife, but as a strategic partner. She handled correspondence, managed political alliances, and even took matters into her own hands when Antony was away. Fulvia's story is one of a woman who refused to stay silent while the Republic crumbled. She was a warrior in a time of men, and her legacy is one of ambition, power, and defiance. Fulvia was a woman of remarkable ambition. In an era when women couldn't even vote, she raised an army in her husband's name, declaring war on his rival, Octavian, the rising star and heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was threatening Antony's power and publicly humiliating him, and Fulvia wasn't about to sit back and watch. To her, this wasn't just a political rivalry, it was personal. She believed that Octavian was dismantling her husband's legacy, and she was determined to stop him. With Antony's brother, Lucius Antonius, by her side, Fulvia took up arms, and thus began the Perusian War. They seized cities, rallied soldiers, and even occupied Perugia. For months, Fulvia resisted Octavian's siege. Supplies ran low, and the people of the city began to starve, but Fulvia never wavered. She held on as long as she could, but eventually the city fell. Octavian spared her life, though barely. She fled to Greece, where she hoped to find solace in reuniting with her husband. However, instead of the gratitude she expected, Fulvia found a cold distance. Antony blamed her for the war, for the fallout, and for nearly destroying their cause. She died shortly after, alone and politically ruined. Was she overambitious? Perhaps, but Fulvia wasn't driven by vanity or power for its own sake. She was driven by loyalty, a loyalty to her husband and his cause. Her downfall wasn't because she aimed too high, but because she dared to claim it all. Fulvia remains one of the few women in Roman history to command troops in open rebellion, and for a brief moment, she didn't just influence Rome, she tried to rule it. Chapter 4. Julia the Elder. Julia the Elder was born into destiny. As the only biological child of Augustus, the man who transformed the Roman Republic into an empire, her birth was more than a celebration. It was a political event. She was a symbol of a new Rome, reborn under Augustus's vision. From the moment she could speak, Julia was raised not as a daughter, but as a pawn in a grand political game. Augustus had strict plans for her. He passed moral reforms to restore traditional Roman values, laws against adultery, extravagance, and scandal, and he set his daughter up as the model Roman woman, beautiful, educated, and virtuous. But Julia wasn't interested in being anyone's symbol. She was married off multiple times for political reasons, first to Marcellus, then to Marcus Agrippa, and finally to Tiberius. Each marriage served Augustus's ambitions, but none of them served Julia's heart. And so she rebelled not with swords but with scandal. Julia surrounded herself with poets, thinkers, and lovers. Her parties became legendary, where she could be found quoting Virgil one moment and seducing senators the next. Her lovers weren't common men. They were the sons of Rome's elite, and she wasn't subtle about it. It's said that she even made love on the very steps of the Forum, mocking the laws her father had passed. Some whispered that Julia was forming a secret faction, one more loyal to her than to Rome itself. But Augustus, seeing the threat to his legacy, had no choice but to act. He exiled his own daughter to the barren island of Pandataria. No visitors, no letters, no wine. Her sons were taken from her, and her name was erased from coins and monuments. Once the jewel of Rome, Julia became a ghost, living out her final years in quiet disgrace, dying of malnutrition and heartbreak. In the end, Julia's life was one of rebellion against a destiny she never asked for, a woman who refused to be molded into the perfect symbol her father wanted, and instead chose to live life on her own terms, even at the cost of everything she knew. She endured his reign of terror. Disha watched as he executed senators, exiled nobles, and boldly declared himself a living god. Whispers of conspiracy began to swirl, secrets and plots moving in the shadows. But Disha, despite the growing tension, said nothing. Then, in 96 AD, Domitian was struck down in his own palace. Some believed Domitia was involved in the plot. Others thought she knew about it and allowed it to unfold. But one thing was certain, she survived. While many around her fell, Domitia walked away untouched, wealthy, and still held in high regard. For a woman in ancient Rome, this wasn't just survival. It was mastery. Julia Domna, the philosopher empress with a ruthless edge, came from the distant city of Emesa in Syria, a land rich with ancient temples and gods far older than Rome itself. Though not Roman by birth, she would rise to become one of the most powerful women in Roman history. When she married Septimius Severus, a rising general from North Africa, no one could have predicted that their union would soon place them at the very top of the Roman world. In 193 AD, Severus claimed the throne by force, founding a new dynasty, and Julia became empress, not just by title, but by action. Unlike many before her, Julia took an active role in imperial life. She traveled alongside her husband on military campaigns, attended strategy meetings, and gave counsel on law, governance, and alliances. While most empresses stayed in the shadows, Julia was always by his side. She surrounded herself with philosophers and intellectuals, and her court became a center for learning, where poets, mathematicians, and historians gathered. She was called Mater Castrorum, mother of the camp, and Mater Senatus et Patriae, mother of the Senate and the fatherland. Yet, despite all her wisdom, Julia had a darker side. After Severus's death, their two sons, Caracalla and Geta, inherited the empire. Julia pleaded for them to rule jointly to prevent bloodshed. But Caracalla, never one for peace, had his brother murdered in Julia's arms. It said that Geta's blood stained her dress, but she said nothing. From that moment, Julia ruled through Caracalla. He trusted no one but her, but his reign was ruthless. When Caracalla was assassinated during a military campaign, Julia was left exposed. She had lost her sons, her husband, and the illusion of control. Rather than be cast aside, Julia chose her own end. She stopped eating, locked herself away, and died of starvation, still draped in the robes of an empress. Julia Domna was a philosopher, a mother, a strategist, and a woman who had held the empire together with poise and silence. Even in her grief, she remained composed. Even in death, she maintained her dignity. Julia Mesa, the grandmother who made emperors, was a woman who knew how to navigate the world of power without ever holding a sword. She wasn't a woman of war in the traditional sense. She didn't command armies or ride into battle. But Julia Mesa may have been one of the most dangerous women in Roman history. She was the sister of Julia Domna and hailed from the same powerful Syrian city of Emesa, where priest-kings traced their ancestry back to the sun god Elagabalus. Wealthy and sharp, Julia Mesa quietly observed the throne even after it slipped from her family's grasp. When her nephew, Emperor Caracalla, was assassinated, the Severan dynasty seemed doomed. The new ruler, Macrinus, lacked imperial blood. He was a military man, not a member of Rome's royal line. Exiled from court along with her daughter and grandsons, Julia Mesa was far from finished. Back in Syria, she spread a rumor her 14-year-old grandson, Elagabalus, was not only Caracalla's illegitimate son, but the rightful heir to Rome. The Eastern legions believed her, or perhaps they wanted to. Either way, they declared young Elagabalus emperor, and Mesa funded the rebellion with her own fortune. In 218 AD, her gamble paid off. Macrinus was defeated, and Elagabalus, now emperor, was a teenager controlled by his grandmother. At first, Mesa was hailed as a savior. She even sat in the Senate chamber, an unprecedented honor for a woman. But Elagabalus proved to be a problem. He was more priest than emperor, introducing foreign gods, marrying multiple times, including a Vestal virgin, and shocking Rome with his wild, chaotic behavior. Seeing the danger, Mesa made a brutal choice. She abandoned Elagabalus and turned to her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, a quiet, obedient boy. In 222 AD, Mesa helped orchestrate Elagabalus's assassination, and both he and his mother were dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. Rome moved on, but Mesa remained. She had made not one but two emperors. When she died, she was honored as Augusta, empress in all but title. Julia Mesa never wore a crown, but for nearly a decade, she ruled Rome from behind the veil with coin, cunning, and the cold patience of a grandmother who knew exactly what she wanted. Julia Soaemias, the mother of madness, was born into a legacy of power. Her mother, Julia Mesa, had mastered the art of political maneuvering, and her aunt, Julia Domna, had once ruled beside Emperor Septimius Severus. When Julia Soaemias gave birth to a son, Elagabalus, she wasn't just raising a child, she was raising a future emperor. After Caracalla's death and her family's fall from grace, Soaemias followed her mother into exile. But in the shadows, a plan was already taking shape. Her son, a teenager and a priest of the sun god Elagabalus in their native Syria, became the center of that plan. Together, Soaemias and Mesa claimed Elagabalus was the illegitimate son of Caracalla and the true heir to Rome. It was a clever lie, but one that worked. The eastern legions rallied behind them, promising glory, wealth, and divine favor. By 218 AD, the boy emperor, just 14, marched into Rome with his mother at his side. Soaemias wasn't just the emperor's mother, she was the power behind the throne. She held the title Augusta, appeared on coins, attended Senate meetings, an unheard-of privilege for a woman, and made decisions of state. But what she truly protected was chaos. Elagabalus was unpredictable, trying to replace Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with his own eastern deity. His reign would become known for its wildness, but it was Soaemias who kept the empire in her grasp. He danced in priestly robes, married multiple women and men, and held public rituals that scandalized even the most liberal Romans. But none of this stopped her. Julia Soaemias not only tolerated it, she encouraged him. She shielded her son from criticism, dismissed advisors who warned of potential unrest, and tightened her grip on power as his reign unraveled. Eventually, even Mesa, her mother, had enough. Fearing a revolt, she shifted her support to her younger grandson, Severus Alexander. But Soaemias stood her ground, loyal to her son to the very end. In 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace. Elagabalus and Soaemias were slaughtered, their bodies dragged through the streets and discarded into the Tiber River. No honor, no funeral, no lasting memory. At least not the kind they had hoped for. Julia Soaemias had gambled everything on her son's divinity, but in Rome, gods are made and unmade by the sword. She ruled through a boy who believed himself a god and died as the mother of a fallen empire. Julia Mamaia was the final link in a powerful chain, the last of the Severan women who ruled Rome, not from thrones but from behind them. She was the daughter of Julia Mesa and the younger sister of Julia Soaemias. While her sister was consumed by the madness of Elagabalus's reign, Mamaia watched quietly, biding her time. Her son, Severus Alexander, was everything Elagabalus was not. Calm, thoughtful, studious, perfectly molded for a woman like Mamaia to control. After the violent fall of Elagabalus and Soaemias in 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard turned to Mamaia's son, a mere 13-year-old boy. The Senate confirmed him, and Rome breathed a sigh of relief. Mamaia stepped into power, though she was never crowned empress. She ruled nonetheless, handling the imperial court with icy efficiency. She surrounded her son with scholars and advisors, dictated policy, approved decrees, and controlled access to the young emperor. If anyone wanted to speak with him, they had to go through her first. Mamaia revived Rome's decayed institutions, reinstated traditional Roman values, and restored dignity to the empire after years of excess. But there was a cost. Mamaia was distant, cold, and obsessed with control. Senators feared her, generals resented her, and even her own son began to feel the weight of her dominance. She micromanaged everything, even his personal life. When Severus Alexander married, Mamaia clashed with his wife, driving her away. She couldn't share power, not even with her daughter-in-law. The empire limped forward until it met the Germanic frontier. In 235 AD, a massive uprising called for the emperor's presence, and Mamaia joined him on campaign. But even then, she refused to let go. She handled negotiations, dismissed experienced commanders, and stalled action in favor of diplomacy. The soldiers had had enough. They wanted action. They wanted a leader who didn't need his mother to speak for him. The Praetorian Guard mutinied, and Mamaia and her son were murdered in their tent, betrayed by their own troops. Their bodies, once symbols of order, were left abandoned in the mud. Julia Mamaia died as she had lived, at the center of power, clutching control until it was torn away. She was the last of the great Severan women, and with her fall, everything they had built collapsed. Faustina the Younger, the empress who loved danger, was born into royalty, the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, and the wife of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. To the public, she was the ideal Roman woman, noble, graceful, and a mother to many. But behind this polished image, Faustina carried a reputation that made the Roman elite whisper. She was said to be passionate, dangerously so. While her husband meditated on virtue and Stoic philosophy, Faustina was rumored to be stirring chaos behind the scenes. Ancient sources claimed she had numerous affairs, some with soldiers, some with actors, even gladiators, the lowest of the low in Roman society. Whether these rumors were true or not, the gossip stuck. The image of an empress with a taste for power and danger captivated the imagination of Rome. But it wasn't just about affairs. Faustina was involved in plots, promotions, and palace intrigues. Her influence over Marcus Aurelius was quiet but undeniable. Some believed she had a hand in appointments to key military positions. Others accused her of having enemies removed from court entirely. One of the most dramatic stories surrounding Faustina came during the revolt of Avidius Cassius. In 175 AD, Cassius, a general in the east, declared himself emperor, falsely claiming that Marcus Aurelius was dead. And who supported him? Some ancient writers suggest Faustina did. It was whispered she had grown tired of her aging philosopher husband and saw Cassius, young, powerful, and admired, as a better future. Whether she truly betrayed Marcus is uncertain, but the accusation was enough to stain her reputation. Marcus, ever calm, crushed the rebellion, but he never publicly condemned Faustina. In fact, he defended her reputation until the end. But even he couldn't save her from fate. While traveling with the army in the east, Faustina fell ill and died suddenly in 175 AD, at the age of just 40. Her death devastated Marcus, who had her deified. Temples were built in her honor, coins minted in her name, and to the empire she became Faustina Augusta. To historians, she remains an enigma. Was she a loyal empress maligned by jealous men, or a cunning operator hidden behind a soft smile? Faustina the Younger left behind 14 children, a shattered husband, and a legacy forever caught between admiration and suspicion. Paulina, the wife who chose to die, wasn't born a queen or a noble. She didn't rule an empire or lead an army. In fact, she remains one of the quieter figures in Roman history. But her story is unforgettable. She was the wife of Seneca, the philosopher, playwright, and former advisor to Emperor Nero. Their marriage was one of deep respect and rare affection, something not often seen among the Roman elite. Seneca, once powerful and close to the emperor, had fallen out of favor. His Stoic teachings, his quiet wealth, and his moral influence all made Nero uneasy. In 65 AD, the infamous Pisonian conspiracy sought to overthrow Nero. Whether Seneca was truly involved is unclear, but Nero saw his chance and ordered Seneca to take his own life. It was a quiet execution, disguised as an act of honor. Paulina, upon hearing the sentence, made a decision that few would understand. She would die alongside her husband. In a Rome ruled by betrayal, fear, and self-preservation, Paulina's choice was both astonishing and defiant. She opened her veins beside Seneca, determined to share in his fate. Their home became a tomb of silence, broken only by the sounds of flowing blood and whispered goodbyes. But Nero was watching. The death of Seneca was necessary, but the death of Paulina was inconvenient. She came from a respected family, and her suicide might draw sympathy or raise questions. So, at the last moment, Nero ordered her life be saved. Physicians rushed in, bandaged her wounds, forced air into her lungs, and slowly, painfully, Paulina survived. But she was never the same. The woman who emerged from that attempt at death was pale, frail, and ghost-like. She bore the scars not just of the knife, but of a broken world, one where love and loyalty could cost you your future and your peace. We don't know how long Paulina lived after that day. History fades around figures like her, women who refused to play the roles expected of them. In imperial Rome, there was one thing rare above all else: silent courage. She didn't raise an army, didn't poison an emperor, didn't make a public spectacle. All she did was refuse to let her husband die alone. In her quiet strength, she showed a type of resilience that left a lasting mark on history. Calpurnia. Julius Caesar's third wife found herself haunted by unsettling dreams in the final hours before the Ides of March. That restless night, filled with dread and ominous visions, she dreamt of Caesar lying in her arms, bleeding, lifeless. She saw a statue pouring with blood, heard cries in the dark. The warning was clear, but she couldn't shake it. Calpurnia was not a politician or schemer. She was married to Caesar late in his life, chosen for alliance, not love. Yet of all the women in Caesar's world, she was the one by his side when it mattered most. She was quiet, loyal, beautiful, and astute enough to understand the man she had married, a man who had crossed the Rubicon, defied the Senate, and declared himself dictator for life. He had enemies lurking in every corner of Rome, walking among daggers disguised as smiles. On that morning, March 15, 44 BC, Calpurnia begged him not to go to the Senate. She pleaded, wept, told him that her dreams were omens, that something terrible would happen. For a moment, Caesar listened. But Rome was not one to bend to superstition, and Caesar, a man of action, did not stay hidden for long. Soon, Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, arrived and mocked the dreams. He told Caesar he'd look weak if he didn't appear in public, and just like that, Caesar rose, dressed, and walked into history. Calpurnia never saw him alive again. When the news broke that her husband had been stabbed 23 times by men he considered friends, Calpurnia didn't scream or faint. She simply gathered his personal papers, sealed his home, and gave Mark Antony what he needed to take control. After that, she quietly vanished from history. No revenge, no scandal, just silence. Yet the memory of her warning, her dreams, and her quiet grief lingered, as a reminder of the woman who saw the end but was never listened to. Servilia Capionis lived at the heart of one of Rome's most dangerous storms, and yet she survived it all. Not an empress, not a warrior, but with her presence, her bloodline, and her silence, Servilia wielded power over the most influential men in Rome. She was the half-sister of Cato the Younger, the staunch Republican who died opposing Caesar, and the mother of Marcus Junius Brutus, the man who would end Caesar's life. For over 20 years, she was Julius Caesar's mistress, and their relationship endured through marriages, wars, and shifting political alliances. Caesar, obsessed with her, even gave her properties and gifts that raised eyebrows in the Senate. Some said he gave her a priceless pearl. Others whispered of political secrets he shared with her. Servilia didn't need to speak often. When she entered a room, she simply had to be there. Her knowledge was her power. After Caesar's assassination, many wondered if Servilia had known it was coming. Some accounts say that Caesar once joked during a Senate meeting that if Brutus were plotting to kill him, he'd be safe because Servilia was already selling him out. Was it a joke? A warning? Or perhaps a truth Caesar chose to ignore? On the day of Caesar's murder, Servilia may have tried to warn him, not with dreams like Calpurnia, but with political caution. Others say she stayed silent, torn between her lover and her son. After the assassination, Servilia did not flee or celebrate. She stayed in Rome, quietly enduring the collapse of the Republic and the rise of vengeance. When Brutus died in battle, hunted by Mark Antony and Octavian, Servilia remained untouched. Her power, though never official, was dangerous precisely because it was quiet. Sometimes the most dangerous woman in the room is the one who says nothing and knows everything. Claudia Octavia, born into the highest circles of Roman nobility, was the daughter of Emperor Claudius and his third wife. Valeria Messalina, whose legacy was marked by scandal and shame. After Messalina's execution, Octavia was raised under the tight control of her stepmother, Agrippina the Younger. Her childhood was one of constant danger and public expectation. From a young age, she was trained not to speak but to survive. As a teenager, she was married to Nero in a political move to secure his future claim to the throne. From that moment, her life became a cage. Initially, Octavia was praised as the ideal Roman wife, modest, obedient, dignified, but none of that mattered to Nero. He had no interest in her and eventually sought other women, particularly one woman, Poppaea Sabina. Octavia became a symbol of everything Nero hated: tradition, restraint, and public duty. Yet the people of Rome loved her. She represented the last flicker of the Claudian line and a connection to Rome's respected past. Her popularity became her shield, but not for long. When Poppaea entered Nero's life, everything changed. Nero wanted to marry her, but divorce alone wouldn't suffice. Rome would not accept the humiliation of Octavia without justification. So Nero created one. He accused Octavia of infertility and adultery, bringing in false witnesses to support the claims. The charges were outrageous, and the people rioted in her defense, tearing down statues of Poppaea and shouting Octavia's name in the streets. But Nero didn't back down. He exiled Octavia to the island of Pandateria, the same place her step-grandmother Julia the Elder had been sent long ago. Alone, terrified, and stripped of her titles, Octavia awaited her fate. It came quickly. On Nero's orders, soldiers arrived and executed her. She was just 22 years old. Her head was severed and sent to Poppaea as a grim trophy. Octavia never sought power, never plotted, betrayed, or defied. She was simply in the way, and in Nero's Rome, that was enough to die for. Scribonia was the second wife of Octavian, who would later become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Unlike the women who came after her, Scribonia didn't fade into silence. She had already been married twice before their union, both times to prominent Roman politicians. She was older than Octavian, wiser, and less easily impressed. Their marriage was a political one, a tool to secure a crucial alliance during Rome's civil wars. From their union came a daughter, Julia the Elder. But Scribonia was never content to play the obedient role. She had a sharp tongue and a sharp mind, and she didn't hide either. This made her inconvenient. Augustus, who crafted his image around control and stability, couldn't stand her defiance. Just a day after giving birth to their daughter, Scribonia was divorced. Augustus claimed she was too opinionated, that she had dared to speak when he wanted silence. He replaced her with Livia Drusilla, who was poised, cold, and perfectly submissive to his public image. Livia would become the ideal Roman matron. Scribonia, in contrast, was cast aside, but she didn't disappear. She remained close to her daughter, Julia, and when Augustus forced Julia into multiple political marriages, Scribonia stood by her side. When Julia was eventually exiled for defying Augustus's strict moral laws, accused of adultery and public indecency, Scribonia chose to go with her, to the desolate island of Pandateria. It was Scribonia's final act of defiance, choosing exile alongside her daughter. In a world where the price of speaking out was often too high, she had no throne, no title, but she had something far rarer in the world of Roman women: loyalty. There are no records to describe her life after her exile. She fades from history as quietly as she lived, but her legacy remains. Scribonia was never glorified in statues or praised by poets. Historians didn't sing her praises, but she was a woman who refused to bend. She stood up to the most powerful man in the world, not with weapons, not with rebellion, but with words, presence, and an unwavering refusal. In a world where silence was safety, that made her dangerous. Sometimes the worst thing a Roman woman could do was have her own voice. Antonia Minor was born into a prestigious dynasty. She was the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, the niece of Augustus, and eventually the grandmother of an emperor. Antonia was the quiet force holding the early imperial family together. But her story isn't one of gentle motherhood. It's a tale of silence, manipulation, and survival. She married Nero Claudius Drusus, the brother of Tiberius, and gave birth to 3 children, including one who would rise higher than anyone expected, Claudius. But for most of his life, Antonia saw Claudius as a disappointment. He was sickly, stammered, and limped. More interested in history than politics, he was not the son Antonia had hoped for. She even mocked him, referring to him not as her son, but as a monster, hiding him from the public eye. Claudius later recalled being treated like a joke by his own mother. But Antonia's cruelty wasn't limited to her son. Her granddaughter, Livilla, was accused of conspiring with the ambitious commander of the Praetorian Guard, Seneca, to murder her husband and place Seneca closer to the throne. When the conspiracy was uncovered, Antonia didn't cry or deny the accusations. She handed her granddaughter over to the authorities, even allegedly locking Livilla in a room and allowing her to starve to death. This was the kind of woman Antonia was, loyal to Rome, not to blood. When Caligula, her great-nephew, became emperor, she watched the empire descend into madness. His cruelty, excesses, and executions disgusted her. She tried to advise him, but Caligula mocked her in public and ignored her altogether. As an old woman, Antonia reportedly took her own life, unable to bear what Rome had become. She had been the silent backbone of the Julio-Claudian line, raising emperors, exiling traitors, and enduring more family betrayal than most could endure. Antonia Minor wasn't loved or praised, but she was feared and respected. In a world ruled by men, she taught them all how to survive, even if it meant turning on your own. Claudia was born into the powerful Claudian family, with wealth, education, and connections. But unlike most Roman noblewomen, Claudia didn't stay hidden behind walls or limit her words to whispers. She stepped boldly into the public eye, and Rome would never forget her. Her marriage to a wealthy politician dissolved into accusations and bitterness, and from there, Claudia became infamous. She was known for her affairs, her parties, her poetry, and her fierce rivalries. Her enemies, especially men, accused her of everything, poisoning her husband, seducing senators, and even sleeping with her own brother, the populist leader Publius Claudius Pulcher. Yet Claudia never apologized or faded away. One of her most famous scandals came when she accused her former lover, Marcus Calvus Rufus, of attempting to poison her. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with Cicero, the famed orator, defending Calvus. But in his speech, Cicero didn't just defend his client, he attacked Claudia. He called her a seductress, a liar, a woman who lived like a prostitute in a noble house. He painted her as dangerous, unpredictable, and morally diseased. But Claudia didn't vanish after the trial. She lived on in poems and rumors, and some even believed she was the inspiration for the mysterious Lesbia in the love poems of Catullus, a woman both adored and despised. Claudia didn't seek political power. She didn't need to. She destroyed reputations with a whisper, and in ancient Rome that kind of power was often more dangerous than any sword. Cornelia Africana was not a woman known for scandal or seduction. She didn't poison rivals or seek out the emperor's favor. In fact, she was praised for her virtue, intellect, and quiet strength. But beneath her modest exterior, Cornelia possessed a revolutionary soul. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, one of Rome's greatest heroes. Born into immense prestige, Cornelia could have lived a life of luxury and comfort, but instead, she became known for something much rarer in Roman history, her mind. She married Tiberius Gracchus, a respected statesman, and had 12 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. It was through her sons, Tiberius and Gaius, that Cornelia would shake the foundations of the Roman Republic. After her husband's death, Cornelia refused to remarry, despite offers from even the king of Egypt. Instead, she dedicated herself to the education of her sons. She surrounded them with Greek philosophers, historians, and thinkers. Her home became a place of learning, a training ground for minds, not just bodies. When a wealthy matron mocked her for not wearing fine jewelry, Cornelia simply gestured to her sons and said, "These are my jewels." But what her sons became shocked Rome. Tiberius and Gaius pushed for radical reforms, land redistribution, grain subsidies, and the empowerment of the plebeians. Their speeches electrified the masses and enraged the elite. Tiberius was killed, clubbed to death on the Capitoline Hill, and a few years later, Gaius was hunted down by the Senate and driven to suicide. Cornelia mourned quietly with dignity, but she did not retreat. Instead, she wrote letters, welcomed guests, and spoke proudly of her sons and their ideals. Her home became a museum of resistance, and her words were preserved in Roman memory. The elite tried to erase their legacy, but Cornelia kept it alive. She never wielded a sword or led a revolt, yet through her intellect, her will, and the sons she raised, Cornelia Africana became one of the most dangerous women in Roman history. She planted an idea in the minds of Rome's future leaders, and ideas, as we know, are harder to kill than men. Marcia's story is one of love, betrayal, and ultimate vengeance. She was not born into royalty, nor did she seek power for herself, but fate and a cruel emperor gave her the chance to wield it nonetheless. Marcia was the mistress of Emperor Commodus, the notorious ruler whose madness would be immortalized in history. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, but he was nothing like his father. He was obsessed with power, vanity, and blood. He was a gladiator in the arena and a tyrant in the court. His reign was marked by indulgence, chaos, and the alienation of anyone who stood against him. But Marcia was different. She was his confidant, his lover, and for a time, the only woman who seemed to have a modicum of control over him. She had the emperor's ear, and she used it to protect herself, and perhaps even to protect Rome from his growing insanity. For years, Marcia tolerated Commodus's erratic behavior. He was cruel, paranoid, and prone to violent outbursts. But their relationship was more than just about power. Marcia loved him, or at least loved the man he could have been. But love can be fragile in a world like Rome, especially when one partner holds the power to destroy the other with a single word. As Commodus's paranoia grew, it became clear that Marcia's love would be tested in ways she never expected. Commodus, once a man of indulgence and whim, began to see enemies everywhere. His paranoia grew to the point where he even feared those closest to him. Marcia, though loyal, couldn't escape the suspicion that his madness would eventually consume them both. By 192 AD, Commodus's reign had spiraled into chaos, and his rule finally reached its bloody conclusion. The Praetorian Guard, dissatisfied with his tyranny, conspired against him. Marcia, desperate to stop Rome from descending further into disorder, found herself drawn into the plot. She became a key player, the one who could end Commodus's reign of terror. But it wasn't just duty that drove her, it was personal. She had come to despise the man who had once been her lover. His cruelty had shattered her heart, and she knew that Rome would never be safe with him alive. The plot succeeded. Commodus was strangled in his bath, allegedly with the help of his own lover. Though Marcia played a pivotal role in the assassination, her involvement was erased from the history books. Her name was silenced, her contribution to ending an emperor's reign forgotten. Yet in that silence, Marcia achieved something extraordinary. She ended the rule of an emperor who had brought ruin to Rome. She did it not with a sword, but with a whisper, a carefully laid plan, and the quiet determination of a woman who understood that sometimes survival demands making the hardest choices. Platella's story is one of quiet tragedy, set against the tumult of imperial Rome. Born into a noble family, she was promised a life of honor and influence. But fate had different plans for her, plans that would turn her into nothing more than a pawn in the cruel game of power. Platella's marriage was arranged when Caracalla, the notorious emperor known for his brutal disposition, was rising to power. Unlike other women who used their charm to navigate court intrigues, Platella was caught in a web of politics she never chose. Caracalla, who despised weakness and demanded absolute submission, saw her independent spirit as a threat to his authority. From the start, their union was marked by tension, a loveless, forced alliance based on ambition, not affection. At court, Platella was treated as little more than an accessory to the emperor's glory, a symbol to parade before the people. Isolated from her family and stripped of her voice, she was denied any chance to build her own network or influence. Her every move was watched, scrutinized, and twisted into a tool for Caracalla's propaganda. Despite this, Platella tried to carve out small moments of resistance, reaching out to trusted friends and relatives, seeking opportunities for her gentle intelligence to shine. But in the ruthless arena of Roman power, even the slightest act of resistance was considered dangerous. Caracalla's paranoia knew no bounds. His cruelty extended not just to his enemies, but to anyone who might question his authority, even indirectly. The final betrayal came swiftly. Platella was accused of disloyalty, a charge as flimsy as it was fatal. Rumors spread that she had conspired with senators to undermine the emperor. Whether the allegations held any truth remains lost to history, but one thing is certain: Caracalla would tolerate no dissent. In a dark act of retribution, Platella was executed. Her death was not marked by public mourning, but by the quiet disposal of a life deemed expendable. Platella's tragic fate became a symbol of the cost of power, a reminder that even those born into privilege could become mere casualties in an emperor's quest for control. Some say her ghost still lingers in the dark corners of Rome's imperial past. Milonia Cisonia, the last consort of Emperor Caligula, lived in the shadow of madness. Caligula, a ruler whose reign was as unpredictable as a lightning storm, cast a long shadow over Milonia's life. Little is known about her early years, but once Caligula took notice of her, her beauty and presence captivated him. Milonia was vibrant, unyielding, and unlike many who served in Caligula's court, she refused to remain in the background. She embraced the chaos of his reign, complementing his wild nature in a way that made them a notorious partnership. For a time, Milonia enjoyed the lavish life of an empress, draped in jewels and silks. Her name etched into the annals of Roman luxury, but beneath the glittering surface, danger loomed. Caligula's moods could shift from adoration to abhorrence in an instant, and his reign of terror created a volatile environment. Those close to him, like Melonia, risked everything simply by being associated with his unpredictable rule. Her fate was sealed when Caligula's reign came to a brutal end. In 41 AD, amid growing discontent and conspiracies, he was assassinated by his own guard. In the aftermath, Melonia's fate is unclear. Some say she died alongside him, while others believe she was targeted by those who wished to erase every trace of his mad legacy. Regardless of the details, her death marked the end of a life lived on the edge, a life caught between the splendor of imperial favor and the deadly reality of absolute power. Anna Galeria Fina, known as Faustina the Elder, was the wife of Emperor Antoninus Pius. She walked a delicate line between personal desire and the imperial duty that defined her life. Faustina was celebrated for her dignified presence and charitable works, seen as a beacon of the refined, virtuous Roman woman. In a society where restraint was the ideal, she often played the role of the dutiful consort, quietly supporting her husband's reign and reinforcing the image of an empire built on stability and order. However, beneath her calm exterior, whispers of scandal and intrigue occasionally rippled through the marble halls of the imperial palace. Some sources suggest secret liaisons and political maneuverings, hinting that Faustina's life was far more complex than the public image allowed. While she never openly challenged the norms of her time, her influence was felt in subtle ways. Faustina often interceded on behalf of petitioners and offered counsel during times of crisis. Her opinions, shared in hushed conversations behind closed doors, helped shape the compassionate image of Antoninus Pius's reign, a period later celebrated for its relative peace and prosperity. Yet, her efforts to mediate disputes sometimes stirred jealousy among rivals and suspicion among those who favored a more ruthless approach to power. Tragedy also touched Faustina's life. The early deaths of several of her children and the pressures of court life cast a shadow over her later years. Despite the honor of deification after her death, a rare tribute to a woman of her time, her legacy remains bittersweet. Faustina the Elder was remembered as an empress who embodied both the promise and the pitfalls of a reign built on virtue, yet tempered by the unrelenting and unforgiving nature of imperial Rome. She lived quietly in her husband's shadow, but her life illuminates the complexities of power, duty, and the human heart within one of history's most storied empires. Theodora's rise from an actress to an empress is one of the most remarkable transformations in Roman and Byzantine history. Born into humble beginnings, Theodora started her life as an actress, a role looked down upon by society's elite. Yet she possessed a rare combination of wit, charm, and unyielding determination that defied all expectations. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her lineage and modesty, Theodora dared to dream of power. Her beauty and intelligence caught the attention of Justinian, a general who would later become emperor. He chose her not for her noble birth, but for the strength and insight that radiated from her every word and gesture. When Justinian ascended to the throne, Theodora was crowned his empress, a title that came with both honor and immense responsibility. Her rise to power, however, wasn't without challenges. Many in the court scorned her past, questioning her suitability for the role. But Theodora was resolute. She set about reshaping the empire's policies, advocating for reforms that would benefit the downtrodden, especially women and the poor. Her influence was felt in laws that improved conditions for female workers, outlawed brutal practices, and protected children from exploitation. Theodora was not just a reformer. She was a master of court politics. With empathy and strategic acumen, she navigated the treacherous waters of power. When natural disasters struck or political conspiracies emerged, Theodora's counsel was sought, and her decisive actions often steered the empire away from chaos. Though she remained a polarizing figure, Theodora's dedication to justice and her courage in the face of opposition earned her a lasting legacy. She redefined what it meant to be a woman in power, transforming from a scorned entertainer into one of history's most influential empresses. Her story is a testament to resilience, ambition, and the transformative power of courage in the face of societal norms. Helena, the mother of Constantine, is often celebrated as a saint, known for finding the true cross and paving the way for Christianity's spread. But behind the halo and pious iconography lay a woman of formidable ambition and complexity. Born into obscurity, Helena's rise to prominence was nothing short of meteoric. After marrying Constantius Chlorus, a modest officer in the Roman army, she bore a son who would eventually transform the empire. When Constantine ascended to power, Helena's own destiny shifted dramatically. No longer just a humble wife, she became the architect of her own legacy. Helena used her newfound influence to champion Christianity. She embarked on pilgrimages in search of relics and holy sites, famously discovering the true cross. To many, this was a miraculous sign of divine intervention. But beneath her piety, Helena was driven by a calculated ambition. She knew that aligning herself with the rising tide of Christianity would secure her family's place in history. Her influence extended far beyond religious matters. Helena used her wealth and connections to support charitable works, fund the construction of churches, and influence political decisions. Critics argue that her actions, though cloaked in piety, were motivated by a relentless desire for control and legacy. Helena's story is one of contradictions. She may have been a saint to some, but a woman driven by ambition to others. Her rise to power was a remarkable journey, and her legacy remains as complex as it is influential. In a world where power was rarely shared, Helena carved out a domain of influence that defied the roles traditionally prescribed to women. Her story is a reminder that even the most revered figures can possess hidden depths, and the pursuit of power often comes with a price. The moonlight dimmed over Rome's towering columns and bustling streets. A silence that echoed with the stories of history seemed to fall over the empire. The whispers of the past, of those women who carved their names into the very soul of Rome, continued to reverberate in every corner of the empire. Tonight, as the stars glimmered above, we continue the journey into the lives of those remarkable and controversial women of Rome. Their stories intertwine with the fate of empires, their hearts driven by power, love, and ambition, but often betrayed by the very forces they sought to control. After the shocking death of Agrippina, a woman who had once ruled Rome through the cunning hands of her son Nero, the imperial court remained unsettled. Her death had been violent, calculated, a mother's love turned into cold, ruthless manipulation. But even in her death, Agrippina's legacy lingered. Nero, though crowned emperor, couldn't shake the weight of his mother's shadow. As the years passed, Nero's paranoia deepened, but the memory of Agrippina's power continued to haunt him. His court, filled with sycophants and traitors, looked to Agrippina's surviving allies, many of whom had once been loyal to her, but now found themselves on the wrong side of Nero's wrath. Despite the betrayal that had taken Agrippina's life, her supporters were biding their time, plotting in the shadows, waiting for their moment to rise once more. Meanwhile, rumors began to swirl in the darkest corners of Rome. Some claimed that Agrippina's spirit had returned, not in the form of an apparition, but through those who carried her ambition forward. Could the soul of Agrippina have been reborn in another woman? Perhaps it wasn't over for the mother who had once molded an emperor in her own image. As Rome turned its gaze toward the future, it began to wonder, who would rise from Agrippina's ashes? Julia Domna, the philosopher empress who had once stood beside her husband, the formidable emperor Septimius Severus, watched the empire crumble before her eyes. Her sons, Caracalla and Geta, though heirs to the throne, could not contain the madness that simmered beneath the surface. After the murder of Geta by his brother Caracalla, Julia Domna knew that her time had come. The empire, once vibrant under Severus's reign, was now fraught with instability, and her position as empress was threatened by the very blood she had given life to. With her intellectual brilliance, Julia began to gather a circle of philosophers and strategists to advise her on how to preserve the dynasty. Despite Caracalla's increasingly erratic behavior, Julia maintained a steady hand. She may have lost her sons to power struggles, but she never lost the empire. While Caracalla sought to secure his reign through bloodshed and cruelty, Julia offered counsel, calm, methodical, and unyielding. It wasn't just loyalty to her sons that motivated her. It was the empire itself that she sought to protect. But as Caracalla's reign spiraled into violence and mistrust, Julia knew that survival in Rome's brutal game of thrones meant more than wisdom. When her son was assassinated in a distant campaign, Julia was left alone, her family torn apart. The empress, once regal and commanding, chose to end her own life. Not with the dramatic flourish of others, but in a quiet act of control. She stopped eating, withdrew into her chamber and faded away, her power only ever hinted at, never fully acknowledged by the men who wrote history. Valeria Messalina, executed for her lust and political ambition under Emperor Claudius, might have seemed like a distant memory, a cautionary tale of excess. But her influence, her lust for power, had not been entirely wiped from the Roman consciousness. A year after her execution, a strange thing happened. Another woman with the same passion for control and decadence appeared at court. This woman, known only as Flavia, was beautiful, witty, and ambitious, and she quickly caught the eye of Emperor Claudius. But unlike Messalina, Flavia was more subtle. She learned from the mistakes of her predecessor, weaving herself into the fabric of the empire without drawing attention to her true nature. Flavia's rise, though slow, was marked by her charm and guile. She did not seek to usurp Claudius as Messalina had, but rather she aimed to control him from within. At first it seemed as though history had forgotten Messalina, but now, as whispers of Flavia's schemes spread, it became clear that the empress's legacy had not been buried. It had merely been reborn in the next woman to take power. Julia Maesa was not a woman to be easily ignored. Though not the wife of an emperor, she had learned the art of survival through manipulation and power. It was she who, after the assassination of Caracalla, orchestrated the rise of her grandson, Elagabalus, to the throne. Elagabalus, a priest of the eastern god Elagabalus, was a figure of instability. His reign would later be remembered for its chaos and disregard for Roman traditions. But it was Julia Maesa's cold, calculating nature that held the empire together in the chaos. When Elagabalus began to display increasingly erratic behavior, Julia Maesa's influence remained unmatched. She surrounded him with loyalists, people who were willing to do anything to keep the boy emperor in power. But her real mastery lay in her ability to manipulate not just the court, but the very forces of Rome itself. When her grandson proved to be too unstable, it was Julia who turned the tide. She abandoned him and placed her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, on the throne. His reign would last longer than that of Elagabalus, and though Julia's own role was often downplayed, it was clear that without her subtle hand, the empire might have collapsed. In a world ruled by men, Julia Maesa showed that a woman's influence could extend far beyond the bedroom or the battlefield. Her power came from her ability to remain in the shadows, to direct the course of history with a whisper and a nod. As the empire turned toward the 4th century, the role of women in Roman politics began to shift once more. Helena, the mother of Constantine, had long been seen as a pious figure, a saint to the Christian faithful. But behind her religious zeal lay a woman who understood the intricacies of power. Helena's rise had been sudden, from the daughter of an innkeeper to the mother of an emperor. But her influence would become legendary. As Constantine's reign solidified, Helena took on a new role, not just as a mother, but as a political player in her own right. She championed the Christian cause, seeking out relics, establishing churches, and ensuring that her family's legacy would forever be entwined with the rise of Christianity. But beyond her religious devotion, Helena was shrewd. She understood that by aligning herself with the growing Christian movement, she could secure not only her son's place in history, but also her own. While Constantine's empire expanded, Helena was quietly cementing her power. She knew that in Rome, where even emperors could be toppled, a woman's power lay not in public displays of force, but in the quiet consolidation of influence. Helena's legacy was that of a woman who transcended the traditional boundaries of Roman womanhood. She was not just the mother of an emperor, she was an empress in her own right. As the Roman Empire continued to evolve, the story of its powerful women remained woven into the fabric of its history. These women, whose ambition, cunning, and strength had shaped the course of Rome, would not be forgotten. From Agrippina to Helena, from Julia Domna to Faustina, they left their mark on the empire in ways that few men could ever match. In the centuries to come, as the empire fractured and the West fell, these women would continue to inspire those who came after. They were the unsung heroines of Rome, those who fought, schemed, loved, and survived, often in the face of insurmountable odds. Their stories would echo in the halls of history, a testament to the strength of women who, though often silent in their power, shaped the fate of an empire that would never be the same again. And so, As the world around them changed, the stories of these women continued to unfold, their influence unbroken, forever etched in the annals of Rome, where their power and legacies could never be erased. Their names may have been whispered, their actions sometimes shadowed by the men who sought to control them, but in the end, it was their will that determined the course of history. The dust of Roman streets stirred beneath the feet of a new generation. Though the empire had fractured, its power was still keenly felt throughout the Mediterranean. Now, as the sands of time shifted, it was not just the emperors who shaped the empire, but those who stood beside them, behind them, and sometimes in front of them. These women, those with ambition and intelligence, emerged as quiet rulers of the shifting tides, their influence more subtle but no less powerful. The fall of Rome was a gradual unraveling, a complex narrative marked by betrayal, familial ambition, and the inescapable tension between public duty and private desire. The lives of the women who had once held the reins of power continued to weave their legacies long after the last emperor of Rome had fallen. Their actions reverberated through the ages, influencing not only the world they inhabited, but also the generations that followed. One such woman who emerged from the shadows of her ancestors was Antonia Minor, granddaughter of Augustus and mother of the Emperor Claudius. Antonia Minor's life was one of subtle influence and often silent power. Though not as flamboyant as Messalina or Agrippina, her strength lay in her steady, unwavering loyalty to Rome. Antonia navigated the intricacies of imperial family politics with an intelligence that made her indispensable. She was not a woman of grand gestures, but rather one who wielded. As emperor after emperor perished, she was the constant, the unshakable pillar of Roman power, ensuring that Claudius, despite his imperfections, would rule. She held no illusions about the cruelty of imperial politics. She had witnessed firsthand the erratic reigns of Tiberius and Caligula. When Caligula, her great-nephew, began his descent into madness, she attempted to steer him away from his more dangerous whims. Her counsel was ignored, but she remained loyal to the empire. And as such, when her time came to pass, her legacy was not one of fame or grandeur, but of essential support that held the empire together in the darkest moments. Antonia Minor's influence was not loud. It was the quiet determination of a woman who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. A woman whose political savvy could never be underestimated. She died peacefully, leaving behind a son who would rise to an emperor's throne and a dynasty that continued to echo her resolve. Theodora's transformation from actress to empress is one of the most captivating stories of power, ambition and self-determination in history. Born into humble circumstances, she began life in Constantinople as a dancer and actress, roles that were not just frowned upon by society, but outright reviled by the Roman elite. Yet her beauty and wit caught the eye of Justinian, the future emperor. His selection of Theodora as his consort was not only a political decision, but one that would alter the course of the Byzantine Empire. As empress, Theodora became a formidable figure, a co-ruler beside her husband who wielded unparalleled influence. She was known for her sharp intellect, her compassion for the oppressed, and her unwavering stance in times of crisis. One of the most defining moments of her reign came during the Nika riots, when half the city of Constantinople rose up in rebellion. Justinian, fearful of losing his throne, prepared to flee. But Theodora, ever the strategist, persuaded him to stay and fight, saying, "The purple is worth more than gold." Her courage quelled the revolt, and she became not just an empress by title, but an empress in power. Theodora is remembered for her many reforms, including laws that protected women from exploitation, forced prostitution, and allowed them to own property and divorce abusive husbands. Her legacy, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of her husband's reign, was a quiet revolution that forever changed the landscape of imperial power. A woman who came from nothing became the epitome of strength and influence, a reminder that even those who start in the lowest of positions can reshape history. Faustina the Younger, married to the Stoic philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, often appeared to the public as the perfect Roman empress, graceful, obedient, and dutiful. But behind this exterior was a woman of sharp wit and immense influence, both over her husband and the empire. Her life was one of whispers and rumors, especially concerning her many affairs. However, whether these rumors were true or simply the machinations of a patriarchal society, Faustina's power cannot be denied. What is most remarkable about Faustina's legacy was not her personal scandals, but her role in the governance of the empire. Marcus Aurelius, often lost in his philosophical reflections and military campaigns, relied heavily on Faustina's counsel. She was a stabilizing force during his absence, acting as a regent when necessary, managing the empire's affairs, and ensuring its continued prosperity. Though she never overtly sought political power, Faustina's presence in the imperial court was a cornerstone of Roman rule. Her children, who followed in her footsteps, continued her legacy, with her daughter, Annia Galeria Faustina, becoming an empress in her own right. Faustina the Younger may not have been the most visible empress in Roman history, but her quiet, steadfast leadership behind the scenes marked her as one of the most influential women of her era. Julia Soaemias, mother of Emperor Elagabalus, found herself trapped between her loyalty to her son and the chaos of his rule. When Elagabalus took the throne, it was clear that his reign would be one of tumultuous instability. His devotion to the Eastern sun god, Elagabal, and his wild, unorthodox behavior shocked the Roman people and the Senate alike. But it was Soaemias, ever the political operator, who sought to stabilize his reign by surrounding him with loyal followers, including some of the most powerful men in Rome. Soaemias, despite her son's erratic behavior, remained his closest ally. She appeared in the Senate with him, making her one of the few women to do so publicly. While Elagabalus was busy shocking the city with his eccentricities, marrying multiple wives and changing Roman religious practices, his mother worked in the background, keeping her son in power. But as his reign continued to spiral, Julia Soaemias faced the inevitable. The Praetorian Guard, weary of Elagabalus's antics, turned on him. In a moment of cruel irony, it was Julia Soaemias who was caught in the web of her son's downfall. Along with Elagabalus, she was executed, her body unceremoniously discarded by those who once feared her power. Her death was a tragic end to a woman who had once held Rome's fate in her hands. Julia Soaemias had been the mother of a divine emperor, the force behind a throne, but in the end, she was discarded like any other casualty in the game of power. Her story serves as a reminder that the road to power is often as precarious as it is perilous, and even the most powerful women can be swept away by the tides of their own ambitions. Though the Roman Empire crumbled and the Western world moved toward a new era, the stories of these powerful women lingered in the collective memory of history. Each of them, from the ruthless scheming of Agrippina to the quiet strength of Julia Domna, left behind a legacy that shaped the world in ways that are still felt today. These women, whose names may have been obscured by time, prove that the influence of a single individual, especially a woman, can transcend even the greatest empires. Their stories remind us that in the hearts of empires, in the shadows of the men who ruled them, women forged their paths to power. They manipulated, seduced, and sometimes fought for what they wanted, shaping not only the fate of empires but the very nature of what it meant to hold power. Rome may have fallen, but the legacy of these women, often forgotten or overshadowed, remains a testament to the unyielding strength of those who dared to stand at the helm of history, shaping the future with their wisdom, their cruelty, and their unrelenting ambition. Their names may have faded, but their actions are still woven into the fabric of history, reminding us all of the indomitable force of women who changed the world forever. As the final remnants of the Western Roman Empire crumbled, an entirely new age of power emerged. The world had shifted from the solid foundation of imperial Rome to the uncertain, fragmented world of the Byzantine Empire and the newly emerging kingdoms of Europe. Though the grandeur of Rome was gone, the influence of Roman women, those who had risen from the shadows to rule empires, remained as a beacon of ambition and resilience. One such woman was Galla Placidia, daughter of the Western Emperor Theodosius I and sister to the ill-fated Honorius. After the collapse of the Western Empire, she found herself caught in the turbulent tides of power. Yet Galla Placidia was no stranger to survival. Her life had been marked by tragedy, capture, and an eventual rise to power. Captured by the Visigoths during the sack of Rome in 410 AD, she was taken to the court of King Alaric. However, Galla Placidia did not yield to her fate. Her cleverness and beauty won the favor of her captor, and she was eventually married to Alaric's successor, King Ataulf. cementing her influence in the Gothic kingdom. After the death of her husband, she returned to Rome and, through strategic alliances, became Empress of the Western Roman Empire in her own right. Unlike many women of her time, Galla Placidia wielded influence not as a consort but as a ruler in her own right, acting as regent for her young son, Valentinian III. Though the Western Empire had already begun its slow decay, Galla Placidia fought to hold the empire together for as long as possible. Her governance was a delicate balancing act, one that required not just political skill, but an understanding of the shifting alliances and the external threats that loomed over the empire. Despite all odds, she managed to outlive many of her rivals, securing her legacy as one of the last powerful women of Rome. Her reign was a testament to the survival of Roman ideals in a world that had long since abandoned them. Even as the Western Roman Empire fell, the women who had shaped its destiny left a legacy that resonated through the ages. As the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive, so too did the women who influenced its direction. The most notable of these was undoubtedly Theodora, the wife of Emperor Justinian I. Though already touched upon in her earlier story, Theodora's legacy demands further exploration, for she was a woman who defied every expectation and rose from the most humble of beginnings to become one of the most powerful women in history. Born the daughter of a bearkeeper in Constantinople, Theodora's early years were marked by poverty and scandal. She worked as an actress, a profession that was considered deeply dishonorable in Byzantine society. Yet it was precisely her ability to navigate the complexities of court life and her deep understanding of politics that allowed her to rise above her station. When she married Justinian, she was more than just his consort, she became his equal. Together they crafted a legal code that would serve as the foundation for many modern legal systems. Theodora was instrumental in influencing Justinian's decisions, particularly in matters regarding women's rights. She enacted reforms that gave women more rights in marriage and divorce, worked to eliminate forced prostitution, and ensured that women were better protected against abuse. But her most lasting achievement was her role in the Nika riots, when the streets of Constantinople were filled with rebels. Justinian was on the verge of fleeing, but Theodora stood firm, declaring that she would rather die than leave the imperial throne. Her strength and determination quelled the rebellion, securing Justinian's rule and cementing her place in history as a ruler in her own right. Even in death, Theodora's influence lived on. Her image was immortalized in the mosaics of the Hagia Sophia, where her likeness is forever etched in gold. She was not merely a supporting figure in Justinian's reign. She was an architect of his empire, shaping it with her wisdom and vision. As the Byzantine Empire continued to face internal and external challenges, the story of Theodora took on new layers. After Justinian's death in 565, the empire faced a slow and steady decline. However, it was the women who had inherited the legacy of empresses like Theodora, who continued to fight for their survival and power. In particular, it was Irene of Athens, a woman whose political acumen and ambition rivaled those of the greatest emperors, who emerged as a beacon of hope in an increasingly unstable world. Irene was born into a noble family and rose through the ranks of the Byzantine court, eventually becoming the wife of Emperor Leo IV. When her husband died, she became the regent for her young son, Constantine VI. However, her relationship with her son was not without its tensions, as Constantine sought to assert his independence. Ultimately, Irene's power struggles led to her deposing and blinding her son, a brutal act that secured her place as the sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire. Though her reign was marked by political intrigue and manipulation, Irene's legacy is also one of religious reform. She worked tirelessly to restore the veneration of icons, which had been banned by previous emperors. Her decision to call the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 marked the end of the iconoclast controversy and helped to solidify the role of the Church in Byzantine politics. Irene's reign, though fraught with challenges, demonstrated that women in Byzantine society were capable of wielding the kind of power that could reshape the empire's future. The Byzantine Empire eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, but the power of its women continued to inspire those who lived in the shadow of its former glory. Even as Europe entered the medieval period, the influence of women like Theodora and Irene echoed through the corridors of power. These women, whose names had often been overshadowed by their male counterparts, had shaped the destinies of empires and fought for their place in a world that often sought to silence them. The story of these women offers a powerful testament to the endurance of feminine influence throughout history. In a world where political power was often limited to men, they showed that a woman's strength could transcend the boundaries imposed upon her. Whether through quiet manipulation, bold rebellion, or intellectual prowess, these women understood that their voices, though sometimes hushed, would forever resonate through the annals of history. Even as the world moved forward into new eras of exploration, conflict, and revolution, the memory of these women persisted. They were the unsung heroines who had shaped the world in ways that were often overlooked but never forgotten. In the centuries that followed the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the stories of these powerful women were passed down, not as historical facts but as legends, stories of women who had redefined the roles of females in positions of power. These women had not only shaped the course of history but had done so in a way that broke free from the traditional confines of power. They were not merely consorts or wives, but co-rulers, strategists, and stateswomen in their own right. As the modern world began to look back on the ancient past, these women stood as symbols of the complex interplay between gender and power. They were reminders that even in the darkest times, when history seemed to be written by the hands of men, the influence of women could shape the course of empires. Their names may not have been etched in the same bold letters as those of the emperors they served, but their actions, driven by intellect, cunning, and resolve, were no less important. Thus, the legacies of these women lived on, passed through the generations, and found new life in the hearts and minds of those who understood that power, in all its forms, could be wielded by anyone, not just those born to rule, but those who fought, maneuvered, and loved to carve their place in the world's ever-evolving story. Tonight, let's slip back into that velvet dark corridor of time and keep the lamps low. Breathe. The marble is cool, the air carries a hush, and the city, whether Rome or her shimmering reflection in Constantinople, still hums with names you know and others history nearly swallowed. We won't end anything tonight. We'll only open more doors. Before Messalina danced through rumor and before Agrippina sharpened a sun into a throne, there was Livia, granite where others were gold leaf. She did not whirl. She arranged. She did not shout. She placed. She watched the Republic's last shards slide into Augustus's new order and decided that history would not be a tide but a garden, pruned, trellised, and watered at the roots where few could see. Livia learned the city's rhythms. The mornings when senators' sandals rasped on the forum stones, the hours when petitions stacked like firewood, the pauses between proclamations where a single whisper could tilt a law. Her power never cracked like thunder. It fell like dew. Whose cousin married whom, which estate changed hands quietly, which priesthood acquired a new candidate. All this mattered more than a spectacular scandal. Whispers called her a poisoner. The whispers were lazy. Livia understood subtler toxins: boredom, exile, forgetting. Do not hurl a cup, she taught herself. Remove the banquet. See? The man grows thin. Augustus loved her with the careful affection of a builder for his keystone. He allowed her presence where presence was policy, by his side, behind him, occasionally at his shoulder like the cool shadow that makes sunlight bearable. She befriended wives, thanked slaves by name, remembered who had lost a child and sent figs to an enemy's garden with a note signed in a hand that made even daggers hesitate. She desired not a single golden moment of triumph. She wanted lineage, Tiberius secured, the Julio-Claudian trunk alive and flowering. When her friends sighed that Rome was immortal, Livia smiled. Rome would outlive them, that was obvious. The trick was simpler, to make Rome outlive her as hers. One evening, as the lamps were trimmed low, she found her reflection in a bronze mirror. Serene, yes, but there was a tightness near the eyes. The mirror accused her of caring too much, of building a future that kept taking and taking. She looked away, steadied her breath, and wrote a letter to a certain widow whose orchard touched the Appian Way, arranging a marriage that would look like love. Power, she thought. Is an orchard best pruned at night, where Agrippina was iron? Poppaea was glass, clear when it served her, reflective when it didn't, and quite capable of slicing a careless hand. She had the sort of beauty that made courtiers invent adjectives, then forget their wives' names at supper. She wore scents like strategies, letting frankincense announce tenderness and myrrh foreshadow cruelty. Nero believed he had discovered her. Let him. Poppaea had already discovered herself, a woman whose influence would come from choosing desire's stage, not merely performing on it. She admired Livia's order and Messalina's audacity, then braided both into a new thing, soft power arranged like a noose of silk. She did not need to be crowned. She needed only to be the only one in the room who understood the emperor's next thought, and to appear gently and inevitably with the exact word he craved. Rome called her cruel. Perhaps Poppaea knew where pity belonged, in poems and funerals. She placed hers there with exquisite timing. She could gaze from a balcony at a riot, lips parted in concern, calculating which statue must fall first, so the crowd would feel heard. It was not love with Nero. It was combustion. There were nights when Rome glowed like a theater on fire, and Poppaea watched the flames lick the dome of a temple with a kind of theological curiosity. What do people worship when they have lost every god but hunger and beauty? She suspected the answer was story, and she fed it line by line until the city believed her part in it. Some say she died under the impulse of a tyrant's heel. Others insist she died of the air, a palace so perfumed and thick with schemes that nothing as fragile as lungs could survive it. Yet in the private places where wives were honest with mirrors, Poppaea lived on. The lesson they took from her was not scandal but timing. Speak last, and the decision sounds like your echo. They called her Domitia. A scribe once miscopied it, and the mistake stuck like burrs in a cloak. Disha. But she walked through both names unharmed. The wife of an emperor who required fear like breath, Domitia learned to catalog silence, how much, how long, and when to let it bloom into a sentence. Domitian devoured loyalty. He wanted the city kneeling and thanked it for the ache in its knees. Domitia endured, not like a statue enduring weather, but like a reed utterly flexible until the flood passed. She tasted each day for the faintest hint of storm and adjusted her smile accordingly. Always dignified, never obsequious, she learned the geometry of survival, to stand at exactly the right distance from rage so that its heat warmed but did not scorch. When the knife finally found Domitian in the palace shadows, some said her eyes had been a harbor for conspirators. Others swore she knew and allowed fate to enter unimpeded, neither the door nor the lock, merely the hallway. Rome loves such legends because they absolve it of choosing. Domitian never confirmed anything. She wore mourning, accepted condolences that were also accusations, and lived on with a composure that troubled men who believed death should end all debts. She grew older without apology, wealth arranged like mosaics around a private core she never opened. If she held secrets, history mislaid the key. Perhaps that was her last act of mastery, to remain unread, step back, before emperors, before marble cooled into manners, into the last nights when the Republic still pretended to breathe. There you'll find Sempronia, whose wit could have hung on a triumphal arch if arches carried laughter. She danced, not foolishly, but like a woman who understood rhythm as a form of rhetoric. Catiline had a scheme. Rome supplied him a chorus. Sempronia did not care for his face. She liked his problem. The city had grown stiff with laws. She preferred a little music in the spine. So she hosted salons where wine loosened throats and ideas circulated like blood. Some left her house with sharper words. Others left with notes pressed into their palms, and later woke to realize they had been recruited into a plan. Rome accused her of everything it admires in men: eloquence, daring, a taste for the edge. Was she reckless? Only in the way a poet is reckless, with metaphors and timing. When the conspiracy broke like a poorly fired pot, she did not wail. She arranged her shawl and told a guard he had a scholar's hands. The guard blushed. The chains were not necessary. Sempronia did not topple the Republic, but she taught it to dance on the night before it fell. And that lesson, how to move while watching, how to speak while listening, will outlast constitutions. She was a queen from a country Rome called a province, and God called a thread through history, Berenice. With sea light in her hair and a patience learned in courts where prayer and politics ate from the same plate. When Titus fell in love with her, the city tilted on its axis. He might have made her empress. He might have allowed desire to redraw maps. He did neither. Berenice felt the Senate flinch each time she entered, a foreigner, a Jew, a queen whose grief had watched a temple burn and yet whose poise did not crack. She swallowed great draughts of rumor with breakfast and learned to smile with her eyes only. Titus loved her. That part is not difficult. The difficulty is that he also loved Rome, and Rome was a jealous wife. He sent her away in a letter so elegant it should have been carved in onyx. She read it in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and thought, I have been dismissed by an empire that is not certain it deserves me. She did not break. She returned to her world not as failure, but as a woman who had stood in the center of Rome and discovered a silence deeper than worship, the silence of a city afraid of the future it asked for. What did she keep? A ring? A wrinkle at the corner of her mouth named for a particular smile? She kept, most of all, the knowledge that there is a kind of power which does not end with rejection. That, too, is a Roman lesson, and Berenice taught it without a school. Palmyra wore the desert like silk, and Zenobia wore Palmyra the way a commander wears a breastplate, not as ornament, but as destiny. Rome called her rebellious. Sand called her wind. She spoke Greek to philosophers, Aramaic to merchants, Latin to generals, and to all she offered the same compact. Follow me and watch the map, learn a new language. She did not topple Rome. She reframed it. There is a difference. Rome believed the world was a wheel with itself at the hub. Zenobia took the spokes in her hands and tugged until the wheel admitted there were other centers. Cities where caravans were cathedrals and frankincense could buy you a treaty. Her armies were quick. Her treaties quicker. She welcomed scholars to court and let them argue at dinner because ideas harden into courage when fed. Coins bore her profile not as flattery but as geography. Wherever she looked, roads formed. Aurelian arrived with discipline carved into his face, and the desert sighed. It always comes to this, the dunes seemed to say. Men with titles, women with kingdoms, a negotiation conducted by steel. When Zenobia finally stood in chains, she did not offer Rome tears. She offered it a mirror. The crowd cheered. She blinked once. Later, in a villa far from the sand that knew her stride, she walked her gardens as if plotting routes across an empire that belonged now only to memory. And memory is a kingdom Rome never fully conquered. In Constantinople, where the sea is more mirror than moat, Pulcheria learned early that vows could be architecture. She pledged chastity not because she disliked love, but because she loved power unshared. The title Augusta sat on her brow like a new crown on an old statue. Perfect. Men asked who advised her. She smiled and lifted an eyebrow as if to say, who advises the moon? She aligned herself with bishops the way sailors align themselves with stars. For navigation, not worship. She saw that doctrine made empires the way roads did. She called councils that simmered theology down to sentences, and signed those sentences with the implacable authority of a woman who would not marry, because no husband could be equal to her ambition. Her city learned to read her silences like edicts. Petitioners arrived with their best Greek honed and their humility ironed. Pulcheria listened harder than her statues ever could. Sometimes she granted, sometimes she did not. The trick, she knew, was to make each refusal sound like a future favor. After the parchment was folded and the last candle pinched out, she wrote in a private journal lines meant not for history, but for the soul. I do not refuse the world. I arrange it. The page drank the ink. The sea below tapped the stones. She slept as queens sleep, lightly, with one hand open. It is easy to tell her story as a kidnapping and a return. That is a children's version. The truth is more exquisite. Galla Placidia was not driftwood carried by Gothic tides and then tossed back ashore. She was a seed that knew exactly which soil to root in. Among enemies she studied, languages, customs, the way men paused before refusing a gift. She learned the difference between plunder and tribute and taught her captors the better word. When she returned to Rome, she did not weep and call for old certainties. She stitched new ones. As regent, she discovered that government is less a throne than a loom. Grain, garrisons, the loyalty of bishops whose rings carried entire cities, it all had to be woven and rewoven each morning. She did not enjoy the work. She needed it. There is a holiness in administration, a hushed chapel somewhere between decree and delivery, and Galla heard its music. She wrote to generals with the mother's voice empires respect and fear. The tone that says, "You will succeed because I cannot afford your failure." Sometimes, late, the old terror returned. The remembered clang of chains, the scent of foreign leather. She would hold this memory until it stopped shaking the lamp flame, then set it beside the other facts. Rome was not dead, merely learning a new way to be alive. The story is a jewel in a bruise. Lollia Paulina glittered so brightly that the city nearly forgot to blink. One winter banquet she arrived in pearls, so deliberate they were practically policy. The men gaped. The women calculated. The emperor noticed. Rome repeats that Caligula married her, unmarried her, and punished her with a casual violence that made even marble want to flinch. Whether every detail is true matters less than the pattern it reveals. A woman transformed into spectacle becomes first a mirror, then a threat. Lollia learned quickly that visibility kills as cleanly as swords. She retreated, then returned, then retreated again. The choreography of survival performed to the rhythm of someone else's moods. But do not believe she was merely ornament. She understood that fashion is language. A color at the right funeral, a jewel at the wrong trial, each could sling meaning across a room faster than a shouted accusation. In the end, when power demanded blood, she gave it with her chin lifted, knowing that the only thing left to arrange was how the light would catch her last breath. Rome remembers her as a lesson not against luxury, but against permission. Whatever a woman was allowed to dazzle with, she could be killed for dazzling too well. Some love with garlands. Porcia loved with iron. The daughter of Cato married Brutus, and chose to believe that duty and tenderness could occupy the same bed. On evenings when Rome's fate was a whisper passing between men's hands, she listened without flinching. She wanted not gossip but ground, where to plant courage, where to post a lookout. The night Brutus admitted a certain plan, the lamp guttered. Porcia steadied it. She would be no ornament to a conspiracy. She would be its temper. When he doubted her endurance, she tested herself with pain until even a stoic would have turned away. This was not madness. It was method. To prove to herself that the mind could be taught to stand in fire and call it air. After the knives had done their work and Rome began its cycle of vengeance and mercy and vengeance again, Porcia faced the future like a cliff a ship must thread at storm's peak. In some tellings, grief took her quickly. In others, she lived to press a hand against cold marble and think, "We tried to save a republic that did not know its own face." Both versions honor her. In every version, she teaches the only lesson conspirators ever need. If you cannot bear the weight of choice, it will crush who you love first. Call her Clodia or call her Lesbia, as certain verses do. Either way, she understood that language could be weapon and wine. She moved through Rome like a rumor with excellent hair. Cicero painted her a serpent, Catullus a sacred fire. Between those portraits lies a woman who would not dim to make men comfortable. Clodia used hospitality as strategy. She welcomed poets because poets are spies with better metaphors. She welcomed politicians because politicians are poets who can count. A lawsuit here, a flirtation there, a garden party with just enough scandal to get the right names onto the wrong lips. By evening's end, a policy shifted a degree or two, almost invisibly. In a month, that degree would point an army elsewhere. She sinned, they said. Of what? Refusal. Refusal to be dull. Refusal to accept that intelligence must wear a veil. She paid the price. She always did. But the city needed her, an atmosphere of possibility, a woman who seemed to say with each bracelet's chime, "You could also live like this." Rome never forgives the person who shows it its secret desires. It forgave her less than most, yet the poems remain. Read them aloud. Hear the way desire and injury braid into something like prophecy. Clodia knew, far earlier than the historians would admit, that the Republic's last art would be self-mythology. For one day, some say two, Livia Orestilla was emperor's wife, a sparkling inevitability that dissolved as swiftly as thrown salt. Caligula plucked her from another man's betrothal with the confidence of a child taking a toy from a market stall. The city gasped, and then the city learned how quickly a gasp can become a dirge. We know little of her except the way power used her as a demonstration, as if to say, "Your vows are mine to write and erase." She emerges from the records like a flash of lightning on a black sea. There, gone, and yet your body is still counting the thunder when morning arrives. I like to imagine she kept the shoes from that wedding, tucked far back in a chest that smelled of cedar and regret. Not as trophies, but as evidence. Sometimes, the Empire slips its hand into your life just to prove it fits. You've met Helena already, the saint-smiled mother tracing a cross across the future. Let's set her candle lower and look again. She understood relics not as superstitions, but as anchors. An empire that had unmoored itself from old gods needed new nails, new wood, new stones to hold its meaning steady. She went to find them. Her faith was fervor, yes, but it was also logistics. Caravans loaded with alms, stonemasons hired where memory said a church should rise, letters dispatched to bishops with instructions that sounded like prayers and read like budgets. In private, she weighed her son's policies with the same steady eye she gave to a widow's request for oil. Do not mistake tenderness for softness. She knew the world's weight and lifted anyway. Critics call that ambition. Perhaps. Ambition is only hope with calluses, and Helena's hands were not delicate. Each relic she lifted became a story you could touch, and that, more than any edict, made a new Rome possible. Again we returned to Theodora, because certain women are not chapters but refrains. The night the city burned with chants and dust and the foundation stones seemed to shudder, Justinian wanted to flee. Theodora did not give him permission. She looked toward the hippodrome where factions clashed in color and creed, and she tasted the air. Cowardice, when shared by rulers, spreads faster than smoke. The purple is a fine shroud, she may have said. What she meant was simpler. If we leave, we are already dead. And so she stayed, and so he stayed, and the city learned that a woman's sentence could hold a city's spine. Later, when the laws were written and the ink dried into a latticework meant to catch cruelty as it fell, Theodora walked the corridors of a refuge for girls who had been taught to pray to despair. She did not quote scripture. She rearranged mattresses, counted loaves, asked names. Reform is a sword made of 1,000 needles. She carried them all, a scribe in Antioch, pressing late into wax tablets while rain ticked on the shutters, copied an old text and found, folded where there should have been blank, a letter. It was signed with no name and many. Livia's measured hush, Poppeia's dark perfume of words, Domitia's perfect pause, Sempronia's laughter when the argument finally turns her way. In other lines, Berenice's grace, Zenobia's sand-bright clarity, Pulcheria's vow, Galla's loom, Lollia's defiant glitter, Portia's iron, Clodia's chime, Orestila's lightning, Helena's iron hope, Theodora's last word, all those voices layered like palimpsest. The letter wasn't a manifesto. It was an invitation, a reminder sent forward to later centuries and to you, that the empire was always a conversation crowded with women who were told to hush, and instead learned to sing below the hearing of official history. The scribe hesitated, then copied it as faithfully as he could, smudges and all, into the margins of a chronicle nobody reads for pleasure. That is how a different Rome survives, tucked in margins, passed between readers who know the art of looking left when everyone else looks right. They gathered without banners, without vows, without any gesture that would make a man sharpen a knife. Some were noble, some not. Some pious, some shivering still from an old fever called power. They met in houses whose courtyards smelled of watered basil, and in baths where steam made eavesdropping hard. They shared methods the way midwives share recipes for endurance. One taught how to sign a letter so the reader believes it was his idea. Another explained how to position a lamp so the light makes a chancellor think he is being understood. A third, older, her wrists still bearing marks from bracelets she no longer wore, described the precise moment to forgive an enemy in public and ask him to lunch. It was not mercy, she said. It was leverage softened with bread. Among them, a young widow with eyes like rain asked if it was wicked to want influence. An elder, whose name history mispronounced and whose patience history never measured, said, "Daughter, wicked is what power calls a woman who remembers the future." They had no leader, but they had a symbol, a laurel crown burned to ash and kept in a small bronze jar. Some nights they lifted the lid and dabbed a bit onto their wrists as if it were perfume. "We remember," they said. "We remember the women Rome would prefer to forget. On a spring night perfumed with crushed mint, a girl in a violet shawl knocked twice at a gate painted blue. She carried a scroll. Not a denunciation, not a love letter, something stranger. Instructions. Her grandmother had whispered names like beads, Agrippina, Messalina, Fulvia, and told stories that tasted like pomegranate, sweet, staining, impossible to forget. The girl had come to add a name of her own. The door opened. A woman whose hair had gone silver the way frost takes a field offered the girl water and a seat. The scroll unrolled. The instructions were simple. A list of women who needed schooling, and a note about which senator could be bent with kindness and which would require the gentle pressure of rumor. At the bottom, a request for nothing less than the next 50 years. They spoke until the lamps were low and the girl's ink-stained fingers stopped shaking. When she left, the city was not different. But the city was doomed to be different. There is a difference, and the women of the Ashen Laurel had built their lives within it. The list is longer than any one night allows. That is the point. Our stories tonight are not a conclusion but a corridor. And look, there are more doors. Imagine a map, not of provinces, but of echoes. Press your ear to it. Hear Livia suggesting patience in a corridor where a modern minister rehearses a speech. Hear Papia teaching a young executive that compliment and threat can fit in a single sentence if the cadence is right. Hear Sempronia at a college debate. Zenobia in a boardroom that pretends it is not an empire. Pulcheria in a non-profit's charter. Galla Placidia in the spreadsheet that saves a city shelter from closing. Hear Clodia laughing from the back of a poetry slam at midnight. Hear Portia striking a match and saying, "Stand your ground." History is not past, it is habit. And habits are taught by stories told in rooms like this, when the day's noise slips away and only the essential remains. Breath, lamp, page, you. We will not end. The night itself refuses an ending when the road still smells of rosemary and rain, and distant bells argue about the hour. On a desk somewhere, a letter waits with a name at the top the world does not yet know it will chant. In a courtyard, an old woman waters basil and hums a tune she learned in a house where a queen once sat, pretending to be merely a guest. In a palace that calls itself a ministry, a secretary pauses before sending an email and changes a single word that will eventually transform a law. The Ashen Laurel meets again next week. No, not a real date. Don't look for them in calendars or decrees. They meet in any room where a woman reminds herself she is not alone in wanting the levers, not the applause. They will trade notes on the long game, how to bend an institution by teaching it to love a better story, how to erase a tyrant without sharpening a sword, how to leave the door ajar for whoever comes after. So dim the lamp if your eyes are heavy, or pour tea if your mind is waking like the Forum at dawn. Rome is not finished with its women. Its women are not finished with Rome. This, then, is where we pause, not end, our wandering. The marble is cool. The river is whispering names. And somewhere, a girl in a violet shawl is knocking on a blue-painted gate. Oh yes, let's keep the lamps low and the doors unlatched. We're not ending anything tonight. We're widening the corridor and slipping into more rooms. The marble stays cool. The river keeps whispering names. Listen, they remembered her hair first, a quiet crown of brown. Then the way she stood a little behind Trajan, just far enough that the eye forgot her and the archive had to prove she was there. Plotina liked that. Obvious power gets measured, fenced, and feared. Hers worked better as a temperature, felt rather than seen. She cultivated manners like laws, spare, graceful, functional. When Trajan returned from Dacia, the city celebrated in bronze and dust. He spoke long and well. Plotina watched the crowd and counted how loyalty moved through it. Processions are maps, she thought. Follow the movement. Find the fault lines. She organized schools, regulated bread, wrote letters to governors whose greed had begun to squeak. She did not scold. She suggested. Men walk straighter when they think the idea is theirs. Hadrian haunted the edge of their household, all taut string and quick glance. Plotina saw the future already tugged through him and began the careful labor of legitimacy, introductions, reconciliations, a wedding arranged like a treaty. When Trajan lay wan and wavering in Cilicia, paper and rumor collided. A signature appeared that should not have traveled so far so fast. Was it Plotina's hand that ensured the adoption? Rome argues still. Plotina would smile and pour more wine. She had one rule for influence: never announce it. Design outcomes that look like weather. When she died, Hadrian wrote that she had been a model of modesty. The empire nodded, grateful for the word that let it ignore the woman who taught it to balance boldness with restraint. Somewhere, a clerk filed a letter of hers that saved a village from a governor's appetite. That is how she preferred to remain. A line in a ledger that prevented a famine and never asked to be thanked. Vibia Sabina, all polished dignity and impossible distance. Married Hadrian and found that loving a man who loved the world was like sharing a bed with a map. His eyes were always elsewhere: aqueducts, laws, temples. Later, a boy on a river whose name became a star and a wound, Antinous. Sabina didn't fight the river. She learned to build islands. She traveled because Rome never sits. It sprawls. In Athens, she adopted the city's calm the way one adopts a stray cat, gently, with respect. She was carved on coins as Augusta, but bronze cannot show how she cultivated the empire's new religion of reason. Libraries funded quietly, rhetoric schools endowed, the ordinary generosity that turns empire into civilization for more than just the triumphant. Gossip tried to make her a fury, or a ghost. The truth lay between, a woman who measured her life in acts of administration, not confession. Hadrian deified her when she died. This, too, looked like weather, but felt like policy. The image of an empress installed in the sky to calm an empire he had arranged into gardens and garrisons. Sabina remains there still, cool and intact as a constellation people stop naming but keep using for navigation. Drusilla, sister of Caligula, learned that worship is cheaper than loyalty and lasts longer. In a court where an emperor's mood could tilt the horizon, she held still, a center point. Caligula called her divine. Rome whispered incest because rumor is more obedient than respect. She walked through it all as though the air belonged to her. When she died young and the emperor demanded apotheosis, senators swallowed their disbelief with their wine. Temples rose, hymns were commissioned, and Rome rehearsed loving a woman not as ornament but as God. It was theater, yes, but theater teaches habits, and habits outlive tyrants. Drusilla's cult faded with the man who needed it, but the pattern remained. A female figure in the firmament, sanctioned, sung to, and imagined as necessary. It unnerved Rome and educated it at once. Sometimes catastrophe wears a family name. Livilla, Claudia Livia, was beautiful as a statue and, like many statues, kept secrets within her base. Sejanus moved through the palace like a draft. Livilla let him. Poison was poured, or so the rumor sculpted it, and Drusus, Tiberius's son, died. Tiberius retired to an island while the city trembled beneath Sejanus's ambition and Livilla's poised gaze. When the plot broke, it broke like a plate flung against a wall. Loud, final shards everywhere. Antonia, Livilla's mother, chose Rome over blood and starved her daughter at home, the slowest justice in the coldest room. Livilla's lesson was not wickedness. Rome had plenty of that. It was the price of miscalculating a mother's steel and a state's appetite, for example. The household is an empire in miniature. Treason there always echoes into law. The daughter of a philosopher and wife of a general, Lucilla had the sort of poise that makes chaos look like choreography. Commodus, her brother, turned the empire into a circus and demanded applause. Lucilla measured the distance from survival to decency and found it was about the length of a knife. The plot was badly staged. Plots often are when grief directs them. At the theater, a conspirator stepped forward too soon and declared something dramatic. Guards heard the script's ending. Lucilla was banished and then removed, as princes say, to ensure peace. But in the archives of courage, there's a page for her. The moment a woman decided that her father's virtues could not be left to die politely under her brother's arena fantasies. She failed, and history loves reminding us. That failure saved other lives. Plots that succeed rarely protect as many as plots that warn. Not all power sits on thrones. Some of it records. Julia Balbia, aristocrat and poet, traveled to Egypt with a future that did not require her to be anything but agreeable. She visited the Colossi of Memnon and wrote her voice into them. Epigrams scratched into stone like a woman teaching granite to remember. Her lines praise. Play and position. Hadrian is there, Sabina is there, and so is a woman speaking for herself without permission slips. The empire liked to imagine women as muses. Balbia mused the stone and signed the bottom. We often inherit law from men and memory from women. The archaeologist, centuries later, found her voice waiting like a sealed letter. She had trusted the future more than her present. It read her correctly. In Constantinople, the sea held the city like a jewel. Aelia Eudoxia preferred silver, luminous, explicit, spendable. She married Arcadius and discovered that ruling a quiet man requires fluency and thunder. John Chrysostom preached against vanity. Eudoxia wore the word like perfume and ordered a statue raised to herself. It wasn't vanity. It was a signal. The palace would not be humble while it was busy being effective. Their quarrel, eloquence versus ornament, masked a deeper dispute. Who tells the city what to love? Eudoxia lost the argument in books written afterward. She won it in streets where the poor lined up for bread that arrived on time. She died young. The statue outlasted speeches for a while, then both fell, as all things do. Still, her silhouette keeps returning when cities debate whether beauty is a sin or a service. A philosopher's daughter from Athens, Athenais came to court armed with the two weapons most courts fear, logic and charm. She took baptism, a new name, Aelia Eudocia, and a crown that looked heavier than it felt. She wrote Homeric verses to Mary, composed letters that braided piety with politics, and argued that poetry could be administration by other means. Her rivals called her Greek as if it were a charge. She replied in hexameters the empire couldn't ignore. Later, intrigues coiled, jealousies, slanders, the usual municipal serpents, and she withdrew to Jerusalem, a city that tests even saints. There she built, gave, wrote, and walked the narrow streets like a woman who had finally learned how much of empire can be carried in one pair of hands. She kept what mattered, her books, her faith, and the habit of turning policy into story and back again. We will not end. The night itself refuses an ending when the road still smells of rosemary and rain, and distant bells argue about the hour. On a desk somewhere, a letter waits with a name at the top the world does not yet know it will chant. In a courtyard, an old woman waters basil and hums a tune she learned in a house where a queen once sat pretending to be merely a guest. In a palace that calls itself a ministry, a secretary pauses before sending an email and changes a single word that will eventually transform a law. The ashen laurel meets again next week. No, not a real date. Don't look for them in calendars or decrees. They meet in any room where a woman reminds herself she is not alone in wanting the levers, not the applause. They will trade notes on the long game. How to bend an institution by teaching it to love a better story. How to erase a tyrant without sharpening a sword. How to leave the door ajar for whoever comes after. So dim the lamp if your eyes are heavy. Or pour tea if your mind is waking like the Forum at dawn. Rome is not finished with its women. Its women are not finished with Rome. This then is where we pause, not end, our wandering. The marble is cool. The river is whispering names. And somewhere, a girl in a violet shawl is knocking on a blue-painted gate. Oh yes, let's keep the lamps low and the doors unlatched. We're not ending anything tonight. We're widening the corridor and slipping into more rooms. The marble stays cool. The river keeps whispering names. Listen. They remembered her hair first, a quiet crown of brown. Then the way she stood a little behind Trajan, just far enough that the eye forgot her and the archive had to prove she was there. Plotina liked that. Obvious power gets measured, fenced, and feared. Hers worked better as a temperature, felt rather than seen. She cultivated manners like laws, spare, graceful, functional. When Trajan returned from Dacia, the city celebrated in bronze and dust. He spoke long and well. Plotina watched the crowd and counted how loyalty moved through it. Processions are maps, she thought. Follow the movement. Find the fault lines. She organized schools, regulated bread, wrote letters to governors whose greed had begun to squeak. She did not scold. She suggested, men walk straighter when they think the idea is theirs. Hadrian haunted the edge of their household, all taut string and quick glance. Plotina saw the future already tugged through him and began the careful labor of legitimacy. Introductions, reconciliations, a wedding arranged like a treaty. When Trajan lay wan and wavering in Cilicia, paper and rumor collided. A signature appeared that should not have traveled so far so fast. Was it Plotina's hand that ensured the adoption? Rome argues still. Plotina would smile and pour more wine. She had one rule for influence: never announce it. Design outcomes that look like weather. When she died, Hadrian wrote that she had been a model of modesty. The empire nodded, grateful for the word that let it ignore the woman who taught it to balance boldness with restraint. Somewhere, a clerk filed a letter of hers that saved a village from a governor's appetite. That is how she preferred to remain. A line in a ledger that prevented a famine and never asked to be thanked. Vibia Sabina, all polished dignity and impossible distance, married Hadrian and found that loving a man who loved the world was like sharing a bed with a map. His eyes were always elsewhere, aqueducts, laws, temples. Later, a boy on a river whose name became a star and a wound, Antinous. Sabina didn't fight the river. She learned to build islands. She traveled because Rome never sits. It sprawls. In Athens, she adopted the city's calm the way one adopts a stray cat, gently, with respect. She was carved on coins as Augusta, but bronze cannot show how she cultivated the empire's new religion of reason. Libraries funded quietly, rhetoric schools endowed, the ordinary generosity that turns empire into civilization for more than just the triumphant. Gossip tried to make her a fury or a ghost. The truth lay between, a woman who measured her life in acts of administration, not confession. Hadrian deified her when she died. This too looked like weather, but felt like policy. The image of an empress installed in the sky to calm an empire he had arranged into gardens and garrisons. Sabina remains there still, cool and intact as a constellation people stop naming but keep using for navigation. Drusilla, sister of Caligula, learned that worship is cheaper than loyalty and lasts longer. In a court where an emperor's mood could tilt the horizon, she held still a center point. Caligula called her divine. Rome whispered incest because rumor is more obedient than respect. She walked through it all as though the air belonged to her. When she died young and the emperor demanded apotheosis, senators swallowed their disbelief with their wine. Temples rose, hymns were commissioned, and Rome rehearsed loving a woman not as ornament but as God. It was theater, yes, but theater teaches habits, and habits outlive tyrants. Drusilla's cult faded with the man who needed it, but the pattern remained. A female figure in the firmament, sanctioned, sung to, and imagined as necessary. It unnerved Rome and educated it at once. Sometimes catastrophe wears a family name. Livilla, Claudia Livia, was beautiful as a statue and, like many statues, kept secrets within her base. Sejanus moved through the palace like a draft. Livilla led him. Poison was poured, or so the rumor sculpted it, and Drusus, Tiberius's son, died. Tiberius retired to an island while the city trembled beneath Sejanus's ambition and Livilla's poised gaze. When the plot broke, it broke like a plate flung against a wall, loud, final, shards everywhere. Antonia, Livilla's mother, chose Rome over blood and starved her daughter at home, the slowest justice in the coldest room. Livilla's lesson was not wickedness. Rome had plenty of that. It was the price of miscalculating a mother's steel and a state's appetite, for example. The household is an empire in miniature. Treason there always echoes into law. The daughter of a philosopher and wife of a general, Lucilla had the sort of poise that makes chaos look like choreography. Commodus, her brother, turned the empire into a circus and demanded applause. Lucilla measured the distance from survival to decency and found it was about the length of a knife. The plot was badly staged. Plots often are when grief directs them. At the theater, a conspirator stepped forward too soon and declared something dramatic. Guards heard the script's ending. Lucilla was banished and then removed, as princes say, to ensure peace. But in the archives of courage, there's a page for her. The moment a woman decided that her father's virtues could not be left to die politely under her brother's arena fantasies. She failed, and history loves reminding us. That failure saved other lives. Plots that succeed rarely protect as many as plots that warn. Not all power sits on thrones. Some of it records. Julia Balbia, aristocrat and poet, traveled to Egypt with a future that did not require her to be anything but agreeable. She visited the Colossi of Memnon and wrote her voice into them. Epigrams scratched into stone like a woman teaching granite to remember. Her lines praise. Play and position. Hadrian is there, Sabina is there. And so is a woman speaking for herself without permission slips. The empire liked to imagine women as muses. Balbilla mused the stone and signed the bottom. We often inherit law from men and memory from women. The archaeologists, centuries later, found her voice waiting like a sealed letter. She had trusted the future more than her present. It read her correctly. In Constantinople, the sea held the city like a jewel. Aelia Eudoxia preferred silver, luminous, explicit, spendable. She married Arcadius and discovered that ruling a quiet man requires fluency in thunder. John Chrysostom preached against vanity. Eudoxia wore the word like perfume and ordered a statue raised to herself. It wasn't vanity. It was a signal. The palace would not be humble while it was busy being effective. Their quarrel, eloquence versus ornament, mask a deeper dispute. Who tells the city what to love? Eudoxia lost the argument in books written afterward. She won it in streets where the poor lined up for bread that arrived on time. She died young. The statue outlasted speeches for a while. Then both fell, as all things do. Still, her silhouette keeps returning when cities debate whether beauty is a sin or a service. A philosopher's daughter from Athens, Athanas came to court armed with the two weapons most courts fear, logic and charm. She took baptism, a new name, Aelia Eudocia, and a crown that looked heavier than it felt. She wrote Homeric verses to Mary, composed letters that braided piety with politics, and argued that poetry could be administration by other means. Her rivals called her Greek as if it were a charge. She replied in hexameters the empire couldn't ignore. Later, intrigues coiled, jealousies, slanders, the usual municipal serpents, and she withdrew to Jerusalem, a city that tests even saints. There she built, gave, wrote, and walked the narrow streets like a woman who had finally learned how much of empire can be carried in one pair of hands. She kept what mattered, her books, her faith, and the habit of turning policy into story and back again. Somewhere in a convent she endowed, a needle pricked a fingertip, and a drop of blood marked a sleeve meant for a girl beginning again. The register recorded her name, the stipend, the clause that forbade her return to the brothel, the penalty for a man who broke her contract, and the line item for bread, oil, and one ribbon of blue because dignity is a line item. Theodora had written that clause herself, years before, and it held. Laws are nets, needles knit them finer. Fragments of Cornelia Africana's correspondence turned up in a merchant's trunk, sold for kindling and rescued by a boy who liked the smell of old ink. The letters are not grand. They are practical. Lists of tutors, notes on which philosopher drinks too much, warnings that a certain ally of Gaius only loves reforms that elevate himself. In the margins, a mother's instructions on grief, meant for friends newly bereaved. Do not let silence devour the house. Assign each person a task. This too is politics. We told her story already. Return to the day the people tore down Poppaea's statues and sang Octavia's name. It matters because testimony travels oddly in empires. Up, it becomes petition. Down, it becomes rumor. Across, it becomes song. That day taught the ashen laurel a rule they carved into a lintel. When the city sings for a woman, make the moment infrastructure. What can be built of that sound? A tribunal? A grain remission? A law that prevents the next exile? They failed then. They learned. The girl in the violet shawl returned to the blue-painted gate with a new scroll, a list of orphanages that needed coal, judges who responded to flattery and those who responded only to fear, a butcher whose kindness could be recruited with a single story about a boy who loved figs. She brought also a rumor that an old senator planned to name an unworthy heir. The ashen laurel reminded her, do not attack, redirect. Arrive with an alternative that flatters his vanity and saves the city. She laughed, promised, left with a satchel of instructions and a few coins sewn into its lining. The moon was kind that night. You want her in this corridor, though she is not Rome's daughter. Cleopatra reminds our city that sometimes the most Roman woman is the one who refuses to be Roman at all. She bargained with Caesar, negotiated with Antony, read the economy better than both, and died as the only way left to control the narrative. We'll leave her on the threshold, coal and calculus, because some thresholds instruct better than rooms. Suppose Aurelian had a daughter who watched him bind an empire with Rhodes and fear. Suppose she learned a revision, Rhodes and favor hold longer. She might have run a courier network based on gratitude rather than threat, creating the kind of authority that pays its taxes in affection. The empire never gave us her name. We borrow the idea anyway because counterfactuals can tutor present courage. A woman on the Aventine mixed sense and advice in equal measure. Wives came for myrrh and left with scripts, 3 sentences to calm a husband bent on humiliating an enemy. 5 questions to ask a magistrate so he thinks he arrived at mercy on his own. The perfumer kept a wall of tiny drawers labeled with virtues and vices. She would open Patience, pinch out a scent that smelled like cedar after rain, and say, remember, silence is a tool, not a refuge. Her clients laughed, then used it. Walk the forum at dawn. Some statues looked newly washed. Who scrubbed them? Old women with buckets who mutter the names of those the city forgets while polishing the marble men. They add a drop of wine to the water for each forgotten name. Servilia, Paulina, Marcia, Scribonia, Platilla, Galla, Irene, and 100 more. The marble glows. This is liturgy disguised as housekeeping. It works. We have touched Irene of Athens before. Return to the moment she considered blinding a son. We cannot excuse it. Keep also the candle she lit before the Second Council of Nicaea, a small flame before a vast argument, asking a precise mercy of God, that images remain a language for the poor. When bishops signed, they signed not only doctrine, but the right of women to carry painted speech into their houses. Irene, like many rulers, is difficult to praise cleanly. Keep the candle anyway. It illuminates more than her hands. A scribe copies it. A midwife hides it. A student finds it 50 years later and thinks it was written for her. It was. Rome, old, mulberry-wined, ash-breathed, keeps practicing. The Senate still makes mistakes grand enough to be architecture. Emperors, or their reflections in ministries, still mistake applause for affection. But the city has learned a trick from its women, listening as leverage. When a crowd gathers, someone now counts not only heads but needs. That someone has a grandmother who once polished a statue at dawn and whispered a list of names into the bucket. A law changes. A tax softens. A library's hours extend into evening because a note arrives in a prefect's neat hand that says simply, "The lamps are low. Raise them." The prefect sighs, calculates, agrees. He will be credited. The ashen laurel will be satisfied. The city will be fed its quiet dessert of decency. We are not ending. The lamp stutters and steadies. Outside, a cart creaks past carrying figs and the morning's gossip. Inside, a page waits for a new name. Perhaps it is yours. Perhaps it is a woman in a distant province who has learned to make the magistrate laugh just before she asks for a road. Perhaps it is a girl in a classroom who writes an essay about Anna Komnene and feels a door open somewhere behind her ribs. The corridor keeps going. Our feet are not tired, only thoughtful. If you need one last image before we pause, the blue-painted gate, the violet shawl, the knock we've learned to love. It opens. There is, as always, tea and a ledger and a question that sounds like an invitation. So you step through. The ledger closes with a soft sound, like breath against paper. The lamp gives one last flicker, gold, then quiet. Outside, the street settles into afternoon. Even the dust seems to pause. Somewhere, the girl with the essay looks up from her desk, not knowing why she feels lighter. Somewhere else, the magistrate laughs again, and the road she asked for begins to be built. Inside, only the faint trace of tea remains. The ink dries. The gate drifts shut, and the story, having found its listener, exhales.